Welcome back. All right, segment 3 of unit 3. Talking about crime facts. This is going to be a shotgun approach to some stuff that you're going to learn a little bit more about as we go throughout the semester. This is kind of a foundational, like I said, foundational shotgun approach to some stuff. And this is presented in no particular order, except I may have chosen the order, same order to present things that Dr. Marion and Dr. Payne, Dr. Oliver did in their textbook. So let's talk about age. Crime is generally the purview of the young. There's a thing we call the age crime curve. The idea is that most crimes occur or are committed by individuals between the ages of 15 and 24. Somewhere around the age 24, most people that are involved in criminal activity, they kind of go on and move on to normal law-abiding life. There's a point where you just get too old for that. And that's a very basic, that's a simplistic way to put it. I'm not saying that people stop committing crime after the age of 24. They're always going to be older criminals. But most people after about age 24 get out of the life, one way or the other. One way to look at it, and I prefer to look at it from terms of types of offenders. And we talk about age. A researcher named Moffat divided offenders into two different types. We had the adolescent limited offenders and life course persistent offenders. Now, an adolescent limited offender usually is someone in mid-adolescence who, for whatever reason, starts engaging in criminal or delinquent behavior. This is a kid that falls in with the wrong crowd. It might start out simple with some underage drinking or a little pot smoking or some shoplifting. And they get engaged with criminal activity. Maybe they even get involved with a gang for a while. And they will generally stick with this type of offending pattern. And it will start small and it will accelerate through the course of it. And, they'll do that through high school, some of their early 20s, and then they'll age out of crime. That, their peer group will change. They may get, sent to juvenile facilities or sent to prison. And for most people, and this is at least 80% of your offenders, these folks that start in mid-adolescence, and by the time they're in their mid-20s, they're done. For whatever reason, they're done with crime. They're going back to a normal life. And this is most of your criminals. That by the time they pass their mid-20s, they're done. Or they've committed something so heinous that they're in prison for the rest of their life and they're out of the offender pool. Then you have your life course persistent offenders. This is at most 20% of your offenders, probably something significantly less than 20%. We're going to call it that because we really don't know. We're going to estimate somewhere between 10 and 20% of your offenders are your life course persistent. These are individuals that their deviant history, remember your difference between deviance and crime, they begin deviant lifestyles much earlier than the adolescent limits. They're starting before they get into adolescence, before they become teenagers. They're already displaying signs of deviant behavior. And I don't know how much I agree with Moffat, but he suggested that he blamed it all on lack of prenatal care among mothers, prenatal drug use, prenatal smoking, alcohol use, whatnot. Blamed a lot of the life course persistent offender behavior on physical ailments caused by, again, poor prenatal care, which was a big one. He had other suggestions too. That was the one he focused on a lot. But they begin deviant very early. By the time they're in adolescence, they've already been engaged in a lot of deviant, possibly even delinquent behavior. And unlike the adolescent limited offender, they do not age out. They continue with criminal behavior their entire lives. But for the most part, we talk about age and crime. Most people age out by their mid-20s. They're done, they get on normal, they become normal folks. Let's see what I'm talking about. Let's see, book talk, we'll skip that. Let's talk about race, ethnicity, and crime. This is a big, at the time of this recording, of course, this video is recorded in 21. For several years now, it's come, the idea of race and crime has come back into our national attention. But there's always been some discussion about the relationship between race, ethnicity, and crime. Certainly, that discussion is either come out of or been the excuse for certain types of oppression of minority groups, particularly African Americans. Here's the reality. If you look at the race tables in the Uniform Crime Reports, okay, what you will find is that African Americans are grossly overrepresented in almost every offense type. That if you just look at the raw numbers, you'll say, wow, African Americans, they commit a lot of crime relative to white people. You look at African Americans make, and I don't know, I haven't seen the census data for the most recent census, but African Americans make up around somewhere between 11 and 13% of the US population. And then you'll say, okay, well, if there are this many white people and there are this many black people, then white people ought to be committing this much crime and black people ought to be committing this much crime. The reality is the numbers are much closer together, the proportions are much closer together than they ought to be. And a lot of folks, particularly white supremacists and racists, like to point to the UCR and say, well, look, the black people, they commit more crime than white people. There's only 13% of the US population are black, but they're committing, 35, 40% of the crimes. Well, remember, the UCR is not a true measure of crime. It is a measure of activity by the police. And so we can't say that, if African Americans, say UCR, we look at UCR data and we say, well, 35, 40% of these crimes are being committed by blacks. Well, that's not true. 35 and 40% of the people arrested for those crimes are black. That doesn't mean that African Americans are more criminal than whites. And I want to make that very clear, because there are certain types of people, racists, who will look at the UCR data and just jump to that conclusion, say, oh, look, they'll use it as an excuse for their racism. Well, that's bullshit. There is no, I'll make this very clear, there is no relationship between race and criminal behavior. None. The color of someone's skin has no impact, zero impact on whether or not they're going to engage in criminal behavior, other than the systemic inequality in culture. What do I mean by systemic inequality? Another phrase that I would use, I think your textbook uses the term systemic inequality. I would use the phrase disproportionate minority contact. And it is the truth that blacks and whites are treated differently by the criminal justice system and by criminal justice professionals. And this differential treatment tends to result in higher arrest and incarceration rates for African Americans compared to Caucasians and Hispanics. The sad truth is that our criminal justice system continues to be, hopefully unintentionally, racist. That An African American man is far more likely than a white man to be stopped by the police. He is much more likely, after being stopped, he is much more likely to be arrested than a white man. An African American man is much more likely to be convicted of an offense than a white man. An African American is much more likely to be sentenced to prison rather than given probation. And he is less likely to get paroled earlier than a white man. And I have no justification or explanation for this other than systemic inequality in the system. How do we change that? We have to change our culture. The US culture needs to change. We need to quit judging people by the color of their skin and start judging them by the quality of their character. And for our culture, this is a very difficult thing to do when discrimination and racism is taught to children. You watch little kids playing. Go to a playground sometime. I mean, don't spend too time with it. I don't want people to think you're strange, but watch little children. Watch elementary school kids. Watch kids at go to a church that has, multiple cultures going to the same church, and watch the kids' church. Little kids, they don't do it. They don't care what color of skin the kid next to us. We just want to play. Without being influenced, little kids, they just play. They just have fun. They don't recognize differences like that. Racism is a learned behavior, and until we can put a stop to that, until we can find a way to get parents to stop teaching their kids that Black people are different from white people. I mean, people is people. And the truth is the system still has inequality in it. Now, note, it's getting better. Let me put that caveat at the end of this part of the discussion, is that it is getting better. And the current leaders in much of the criminal justice system, they're not ignorant. And most of the people that run major law enforcement agencies, major criminal justice agencies, they've stopped intentionally putting blinders onto the system. And they are searching for, and most of them are searching for solutions and trying to find a way to mend the fences. Not every law enforcement agency is perfect, and not every law enforcement agency is run by people trying to find solutions, and we need to be vigilant in standing up to those agencies that continue systemic inequalities and continue to treat people differently based on who they are as opposed to what they do. And we need to start living in a culture where everyone has the same opportunity. We tell the rest of the world that the United States is a land of opportunity, and that everyone has the same chance to be successful, and that's not true. As a middle-class Caucasian person, I've always fairly had it easy. I grew up the son of a military officer. I went to military schools. By the time I stopped going to Department of Defense schools, in other countries, my dad was an officer. I don't remember. I know my family has been something other than middle class, but for most of my memory, we were middle class. And so I grew up with all the advantages of the middle class. And so I can only talk about what I see and what I read in the research. And, for people that don't come up in the middle class, those opportunities are just not the same. For an individual growing up in a lower class neighborhood with badly funded schools and gang infested neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods are generally infested by gangs because you know, there's the lack of job opportunities. And you know, how do I tell someone to go work you know, to go work a minimum wage job when they can make $1,000 a night selling dope? It's your generation, man. My generation started the fix, started the repair. The generations before me screwed everything up. Maybe my generation, the generation before mine, they started trying to fix stuff. Your generation is going to be the one to get out there and fix it. We've got to fix the system without destroying it, which means we've got to change the people in the system. We've got to change their attitudes, and we have to find ways to be more careful about who we let be the police, and make the police and the courts and the correction system be run by a much more diverse group. You know, so that everybody is represented among the people that protect us. So anyway, enough of that. I get a little depressed when I talk about race and crime. If you're more interested in those subjects, occasionally in the summer, we'll offer a course called Race and Crime, where we spend a semester talking about race and gender issues in law enforcement and corrections and the courts. Talk about the causes behind it and discuss how to fix these things. The stuff that has begun to work on the changes, and then how the current and next generation of law enforcement officers and lawyers and correctional officers and parole officers and teachers and civic leaders can begin or continue the repair. Because right now there's some things that are broken that need to be fixed. But let me move on. This will be a really long video, and some of it's going to be me on my soapbox. And that's okay. Gender and crime. Now, all I can say, and there's research out there to prove it, that race, no impact on crime. Not crime itself. Crime rates, yes, because of systemic inequality and disproportionate minority contact. Yes. Gender, on the other hand, is a funny thing. Yes, the vast majority of crimes are committed by men. Whether we're talking about arrest data collected by the UCR or self-report, National Crime Victimization Survey data, we know men commit more crime than women. Now, the exact how much more, we're a little fuzzy on nowadays, because we're noticing that arrest rates for females are increasing. And they've been increasing since the 1970s. And the thing is that, you know, since the 1970s and the women's liberation movement in the 1970s, we're starting to see our society treat people more equal based on gender. Starting to see. And we've certainly made more strides in gender equality than we have had in racial equality. But the idea is that is we started looking, we stopped looking at women as, you know, this weaker, gentler sex, and started looking at them as more equal. Well, the police and the courts also started looking at women more equally. Because for a long time, we kind of had this chivalry hypothesis, kind of this chivalry thing going on in the courts and with the police, where females and males were treated very differently by criminal justice officials. And that with females, there was a lot more protecting. There was a lot more, oh, this poor woman, she did it because this man forced her to do it. And, you know, behind every female criminal is this male mastermind, which one, I don't know if I want to say it this way, but one, it kind of devalues the contribution of women to crime. Because the idea is men and women are men and women. They're both still people. And they should be treated equally by the criminal. Well, we start treating men and women more equally in the criminal justice system, then rates of female criminality start coming up. Even despite that, men still commit the vast majority of offenses. Sorry, guys. It's just the way it is. Why? Um, Now, some try to blame this on biology, that they say that biological differences between men and women explain differences in aggression offending. Maybe. Biosocial criminology is not necessarily my area of expertise, and so I'm not going to say, that I'm not going to throw those ideas out, but I'm going to go, okay, that's probably the least likely of the possibilities. However, some of the more likely possibilities have to do with socialization and parenting, in that traditionally boys and girls are raised differently. Now, that is something that is changing. This is going to be the next couple of decades in gender criminology. Is going to be super interesting as over the last decade or so, and then continuing on in the future, our ideas about gender and gender roles and gender identity are changing. And maybe it's somewhat some of our identity, some of our beliefs, our understanding of gender identity are changing. Our acceptance of differing gender identities is certainly increasing. Our concepts of sexual orientation are changing. When I was growing up as a kid, we had, it was acceptable to say certain things and make fun of people that weren't homosexual or weren't heterosexual. It was accepted, it was tolerated, and it went from being accepted to merely tolerated. And now, as it should be, it is finally in the last decade or so become a deviant behavior, to be a violation of the social norm, to discriminate someone based on sexual orientation. Keep in mind that as recently ago as my childhood, it was certainly acceptable to discriminate against somebody based on their sexual orientation, where today it is definitely a violation of our social norms, and that's a good thing. Again, just like it is with race, we ought to judge people not on who they are, but on what they do. A person, the color of a person's skin, their gender, their gender identity, their sexual orientation, none of these concepts have any relationship to the quality of someone's character. None of these things have relationship to whether or not someone's going to become a criminal. But there are gender differences. And the research is very clear. There are differences in criminal behavior between men and women, and most of it is rooted in socialization, that boys and girls are raised differently. And traditionally males are socialized to be more confrontational than women. That we're much more independent. We're much more pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and don't rely on anybody else for anything, and blah 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 blah. It's like my old man taught me growing up is you don't start a fight, but if you get into a fight, you damn well better finish it. Where women are much better, little girls are much better socialized to avoid the physical fight anyway. The idea that girls are also, they're raised much more to be much more relationship based. And this is one of the things that makes it very interesting to me, is that from my understanding and my belief, is that here's the reason why women don't commit as much crime as men, particularly violent crime as men, is that men, we aren't socialized very well on how to deal with our emotions and how to deal with our relationships. I mean, we're raised with big boys don't cry. I lost track of the number of times my mama said, "Boy, if you don't quit crying, I'm gonna give you something to cry about." That we're raised to suppress our emotional reactions, particularly when our emotional reactions involve tears. As boys, we were raised to suppress that. And girls weren't. For the most part, girls are taught to be in relationship with others. Girls were socialized to deal with things in groups. And so women tend to be much better at processing emotion, particularly so-called negative emotions, than men are. And when they don't suppress the emotion, that suppression doesn't turn in violent. because they're more capable of sharing their feelings with others and processing them, where men, we just suppress and suppress and suppress until we either have a heart attack or we beat somebody up. It's very unhealthy for us. And so, emotionally, women under traditional gender socialization are much better equipped for handling emotional issues than men are. And that can result in lower crime rates for women. It's fascinating stuff. There are also differences in the fact that, raised girls are much more likely to become victims of sexual abuse as children and adolescents. That sexual abuse of women means that girls tend to run away more than boys do. And then when they run away, they tend to get involved in criminal activity. And so, we get a very different pathway. And we get to Unit 5, when we talk about criminality, one of the criminological theories we'll talk about is life course theory. And we'll talk about how women have different pathways into crime than men. The underlying motivations and reasoning behind deviance, delinquency, and crime for women is very different than it is for men, because of how they're socialized, how we're socialized differently. It's actually a very fascinating measure of crime. All right, so make sure you're reading everything, reading the textbook. I think I've hit the big important ones that I want to talk about. Let you read the book for the rest of the other kind of specialized areas. And so we'll call this the last segment for Unit 3. And in the next unit, we will talk more about crime and crime typologies. All right, see you next unit.